Right before we jump into this video, if you want to take better pictures in only 11 days, I created a free mini video course called 11 Days to Better Photography that you can sign up for right now at froknosphoto.com/11days. Jared Polin, froknosphoto.com, and this is a comparison video between the Nikon D5600 and the Canon T7i. Now, my goal with this video is to help you decide which of these two cameras is the right one for you. So let's dive into some of the specs and start with what sensors are in these cameras. The Nikon D5600 has a 24.2 megapixel APS-C size CMOS sensor, whereas the Canon has a 24.2 megapixel CMOS sensor. They are both exactly the same in terms of megapixels. Now, for those of you out there who don't know, the Nikon has a crop factor of 1.5x, whereas the Canon has a crop factor of 1.6, so it's slightly longer there. Not really a big deal any way that you go. Just remember that you multiply any lenses that you put on these cameras by 1.5 on this one and 1.6 on this one. Now let's move on to the processors that are inside of these cameras. The D5600 has what's called an Expeed 4 processor. Nikon is actually already on the Expeed 5, so this one is a little older. And then the Canon has what's called a Digic 7 image processor, which is much newer, and it's actually not even in the Canon 5D Mark IV, so that is a better image processor. What does that actually mean? It's hard to really quantify and say, but in this case, if I was to give a check mark to any camera's processor, I would give a check mark to the Canon. Now let's look at ISO. The Nikon goes from 100 to 25,600 natively, and the Canon goes from 100 to 25,600 natively as well, all the way up to 51,200 in the expandable mode. The Nikon D5600 cannot be expanded past the native range of 25,600. Now, I'm not going to give a check mark to either one of these because that's not really that big of a deal. Just remember, if you go into the expanded mode, that's what's not really recommended by the camera manufacturers. But now that I think about it, with a Digic 7 processor, I may have to give a slight edge to the quality in the Canon side. But again, it's going to be very similar when you're out there shooting your stills. Now, moving on to how many frames a second these cameras can shoot, the D5600 can shoot 5 frames in a second if you're in 12-bit RAW, and if you shoot in the better quality 14-bit RAW, that only gives you 4 frames a second. Now on the Canon side, you can do 6 frames a second even in the 14-bit RAW, so check mark goes to the Canon again. Moving on to the autofocus system, the Canon has 45 autofocus points that are all cross-type sensors. The Nikon has 39 autofocus points with only 9 of them being cross-type sensors. Canon has done a great job in updating their cameras with really good autofocus systems throughout the entire lineup. It is much better to have 45 that are cross-type than to only have 39 total focusing points where only 9 of them are cross-type. So again, Canon gets the check mark. Now keep in mind, if you're doing landscapes and portraits, where generally the autofocus points aren't as integral to your shooting as when you're shooting sports, then you could go with either of these, especially if this one has less cross-type sensors. It may not be as big of a deal. So in terms of the max shutter speed, both of these cameras shoot at 1/4000th of a second. Now keep in mind, some of the pro cameras shoot at 1/8000th of a second, but this isn't going to be a big deal no matter what, so let's move on to buffer capacity. Well, the D5600 does not tell you what the buffer capacity is, whereas the Canon can do 21 frames in a row when you're shooting RAW, which is a pretty nice buffer, which I would think that the Nikon probably is fairly similar to what the Canon can do, so I can't give a check mark on this one. Now moving forward onto the video capabilities, let's see what we have here. The Nikon shoots 1080 at up to 60 frames a second, and the Canon shoots at 1080 up to 60 frames a second. Now keep in mind, Canon is more known as a video-centric company, especially with their cameras, where Nikon isn't really known as much for their video. They both do very nice quality when it comes to capturing video, but how do they do when it comes to autofocus? Because that's what a lot of you guys want to know, is it like a camcorder? In the past, most DSLRs were really bad at doing autofocus, and in this case, the Nikon will do face base priority autofocus using what's called contrast detection, and the Canon has what's called dual pixel AF. This is not even a comparison in this case. The Canon gets 3 check marks for being so much better for autofocus than the Nikon. The Nikon's gonna be slower, it's not gonna be as accurate as the dual pixel AF. The dual pixel AF that you find in this Canon is the same function that you will find in some of their $16,000 video cameras. The dual pixel AF is absolutely incredible. Also with the Canon, you can use their Canon Connect app to control recording video and touching the focus points where you want them to be when you're shooting video. So in terms of the apps that you can get for both of these, I like the Canon Connect app better than what Nikon offers on their side, so another check mark goes to Canon for that one. Both of these cameras have Wi-Fi and NFC, so no differences there. Neither of these cameras have a headphone jack for monitoring audio when you're shooting video, but they both do have inputs for recording audio. Keep in mind that the built-in microphones in these cameras are not as good as what you're gonna get from an external microphone, so I just thought I would bring that up. In terms of viewfinder coverage, meaning what will you see when you look through the viewfinder, they both shoot at 95% viewfinder coverage. Meaning when you look through your viewfinder and you take a picture, when you review that image, you may have slightly more of an image there because it's only covering 95% and not 100%. So that's the same in both of these. Now moving on to screen size, the Nikon is 3.2 inches and is vari-angle, which means it rotates all the way around. It's great for vlogging. You can hold it out this way, you can hold it up high, down low, and rotate the screen any way that you would like. It's also a touchscreen, and on the Canon side, you have a 3-inch vari-angle touchscreen. So it's slightly smaller, but both of these have almost the same resolution, over 1 million dots on the screen. They're gonna be very similar. In this case, I'll give an extra check mark to the Nikon because it has a slightly larger screen, which may come in handy. So how do you save your images and videos? What kind of card slots do these cameras have? They both have one SD card slot, so nothing different there. Now let's move on to the weight and feel and some of the buttons on the outside. The Nikon weighs in at 1.02 pounds, whereas the Canon is 1.17 pounds. So if you're looking for a lighter camera, the Nikon one is noticeably lighter. Now on the Canon side, you do have extra buttons on the outside, which may come in handy when you need to change your settings. But on the Nikon side, you do have those options all on the touchscreen, which makes it really easy to get to them. So no advantage to either of them for this one. But in terms of how do they feel in your hands, the Nikon actually feels better in your hands, where the Canon feels a little more chunkier, a little more strain was happening on my right hand when I was holding it. Is it a deal breaker? No, because the Canon has a ton of features that the Nikon doesn't have. So really, if you're looking for something smaller, easier to hold, then the Nikon may be a better option for you. If you don't really mind having a little bulkier camera, then the Canon is a very nice option as well. In terms of battery life, I think you're gonna get pretty similar results from the batteries that you get with both of these cameras. As a recommendation, I always say pick up an extra battery because you never know when you're gonna run out of power. Now let's look at the pricing. The Nikon is priced at $696.95 for the body only. The Canon is priced at $699. Obviously, there's no difference there. You need to decide which one is right for you. Now, in terms of lens options, they both have very similar types of lenses that you can get for both of them, so that is a toss-up right there. And before I get to who this camera is for, the most important tests to test out are the wind tunnel test and the sniff test. So let's start with the sniff test. The Nikon smells like Stuffaluffagus. And the Canon smells like Big Bird. I don't know which one's better in that case because I think Big Bird probably smells better if you think about it, because he's more on the yellow side, which reminds me of lemon, whereas the brown, we'll leave it at that. So Canon gets a check mark for smelling better. Now, wind tunnel test is the all-important thing, and I'm gonna step off of my perch and wind tunnel test this one. This is a head scratcher. You know, I'm gonna have to go with the Nikon for the wind tunnel test because it's a little lower to the ground, which means it doesn't block as much air. So check mark to the Nikon for the wind tunnel test. Now this is what it comes down to, is which camera is right for you. If you are just focusing in on shooting stills, I think you can flip a coin and say, I could go with either one of them because I'm gonna get similar results no matter which one of these I have when it comes to stills. But if you say to yourself that I am going to shoot a lot of video, it's very hard for me to recommend the Nikon, especially if you're doing video that requires vlogging or if you're doing video that requires capturing action. The dual pixel AF in the Canon by far blows the Nikon out of the water. So if you're shooting video, you're adding stills in there, it's hard for me to say go Nikon. In this case, I highly recommend the Canon, and I almost recommend the Canon higher over the Nikon for so many of the features that they have. It's just so hard to downplay the amazing feature of dual pixel AF for video. So which one would you go for? If you're deciding between these two, do you go with the Nikon? Do you go with the Canon? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to give a like or a thumbs up to this video if you're watching it, because that helps me out. And speaking of camera gear, no matter if you have a little or a lot, how do you organize and protect it? Well, if you're not sure, check out my brand new app called My Gear Vault. It's the best way to input, organize, and protect your gear so you know what you have and what it's worth, and it's absolutely free. You can download it in the Apple App Store. It will be available for Android at the end of June 2017, so go check it out right now. And that is where I'll leave this comparison. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.